I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. My home here, as well as Concordia University, is located in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, on unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka and Haudenosaunee peoples. I completed my PhD training at UBC, whose Point Grey campus is located on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm privileged and grateful to have spent time in both of these beautiful places, and I invite you to learn more about the traditional lands that you are on by visiting native-lands.ca. And for accessibility reasons, I'm going to describe myself and my space here. I'm wearing a blue shirt, and behind me is a red chair and a bookshelf. We've sent around the respectful space statement and posted in the chat. I thank you for your help in making this a safe learning space. Please note that we are recording this event and ask that you do not record it. If you would prefer not to be recorded, please turn off your video and your microphone, and I invite you to type any questions that you have into the chat. As a final note, this event is hosted by the Language Sciences Initiative, which aims to connect scholars, teachers, and researchers working in all areas of the language sciences to create collaborations that produce and support innovative research. We host regular talks series, inviting prominent language sciences researchers from around the world to present on various areas of research, called Language Science Talks, currently held online, and this is one of these. So, without further ado, I am pleased to welcome our guests today, Dr. Ethan Kutlu and Dr. Debra Titone. So I will start by introducing Dr. Titone. She is a professor of psychology at McGill University and Canada Research Chair in Language and Multilingualism, and she directs the Language and Multilingualism Lab at McGill. Dr. Titone's research areas include cognition, cognitive neuroscience, and behavioral neuroscience, and she conducts behavioral, sociolinguistic, and neuroimaging experiments to investigate many questions, some of which include what sociolinguistic, social network, and theory of mind factors impact first and second language processing, and vice versa. And on a more personal note, my relationship with Deb has gone back many years, as she was kind enough to welcome me into her lab as one of her very first honors students when she joined McGill, which helped set me on the path that I am today. So it really is an honor to be introducing her. Of course, the second person that I'm very pleased to introduce is Dr. Ethan Kutlu. Dr. Kutlu is a 2021 class postdoctoral research scholar in the Department of Linguistics and the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Iowa. And he is affiliated with the Delta Center at the University of Iowa and the Brain Cognition and Development Lab at the University of Florida. Dr. Kutlu is an absolutely stellar early career researcher who specializes in developmental cognitive neuroscience and experimental linguistics. He's examined the impact of multilingualism on speech perception, which you will get to hear more about today, as well as done research on object recognition. And he has won or been nominated for numerous prestigious fellowships, as well as teaching awards, which I will not enumerate here. And I will say it has always been my sincere desire to have Ethan become an official member of my own lab, but alas, that did not come to pass, and he's gone to do other wonderful things. But I will say that we have long considered an honorary lab member and are privileged that we get to hang out with him at conferences and more generally keep in touch with him and all the other lab members. Dr. Kutlu has had the opportunity to work with Dr. Titone, so she's a bit more lucky, on the research that he presented today, and this was during his doctoral degree in 2019. Finally, one final note about both of these fabulous researchers and scholars is that they each do really notable work enhancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in science. And each in their own amazing ways have been advocates for groups that face barriers in participation in science and research, such as women, sexual and gender minorities, and other minoritized groups. So it is really a privilege to have them today to present their talk, which is called Who who is in your network, racial and linguistic diversity impact the perception of different English varieties. And their talk will run for 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions that you'll be able to ask either in the chat or by raising your hand and asking in the video. So at this point, I will turn over to Dr. Ethan Kutlu, who will be kicking things off.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I think I'm blushing a little bit, so it will take me a minute, but thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Let me start sharing my screen here real quick. Right. Give me 1 second. I think everything is coming up. And I am assuming that you all should be seeing my screen. Is that, yep, perfect, awesome. Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, Krista. It's a great honor to be able to share my research with everyone today. And for Language Sciences platform, it's from day one they've been walking with us. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And
I'll just pause you, Ethan.
Oh,
I think we see your speaker notes as well as the slides.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
So probably that wasn't your intention.
Nope. Yep. I didn't intend to do that. Let me switch that. One second. Didn't mean to lose you all. Okay, let's do one more time. Let me stop share and then share again. I think I just actually hit the wrong one. Okay, there you go. Desktop 1, yes. You would think that after a year of working with online, it should be working well, but it does not. Are you all seeing the correct one now?
Perfect.
All right, so I'll keep my notes to myself. Thank you so much for that, Krista. Well, today I'll be co-presenting with Dr. Debra Titone, and the structure of our talk will be such that I will be going over my dissertation research, which was greatly in collaboration with her and her lab, and then later she'll be taking over, and then she'll be walking you through some of the approaches that they developed in Debra's lab in the last few years, regarding network approaches, of course. So I also have my own land acknowledgement. I currently reside in Gainesville, and I acknowledge that the city of Gainesville and the University of Florida both reside on the land of Timucua people and the Seminole tribe of Florida. I currently reside on this land, and I pay respect to all the past and present generations of indigenous people. And before I continue with my talk, I also have a quick disclaimer. This talk features topics on racial inequalities and systematic minoritization of racialized groups. I acknowledge my privilege as a white person and also as a white scientist. And I also acknowledge that it is absolutely important to hear from scholars who are burdened by these inequalities, but also while doing that, they're also working on these inequalities as well. So to reduce these biases and to amplify the voices of those, please refer to Dr. Megan Figueroa's list on scholars to read and know in the field of language sciences. This is posted on Twitter, and if you don't use Twitter, you can also access it through my website directly. And I don't want to give you too much of a disclaimer, spoiler, sorry, but I will end my disclaimer with this quote that we all have accents. All right, let's see here. Okay, so at the beginning of each presentation or each talk, I pick a quote that I believe will summarize what I'll be talking about on that particular day. And for today, I pick a quote from Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. And the quote goes like this: "I show my masterpiece to the grown-ups and ask them if my drawing frightened them. They answered, why should anyone be frightened by a hat? My drawing did not represent a hat. It was supposed to be a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. So I made another drawing of the inside of the boa constrictor to enable the grown-ups to understand. They always need explanations." So I don't know how many of you read The Little Prince. I highly recommend it if you haven't done so. Aside from all the life lessons that you can get from this book, there are also these intriguing questions. And this one particularly attracted my attention a lot, because I really wonder what makes us not see a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. And I know that this is not a new question, because in cognitive science, especially, the ways that our visual and auditory perception and how they can be impacted by different factors have been well studied. So for instance, if I ask you to look at the screen, and if I ask you what you see on the screen, some of you might say that you're seeing a duck face or maybe a bird face. Some of you might say that it's a rabbit. Some of you might say that you're seeing both at the same time. And some might say that you're seeing neither. This depends hugely on your background, your experiences with these type of images, your experiences with birds, ducks, and also rabbits, but also where you're actually looking at the screen. So if you're looking on the left side of this image, you might be more prone to interpret this as a duck. And if you're looking at the right side of the image, you might be interpreting as a rabbit. So the same thing can be also observed in the auditory domain, because we know that is individual variation in speech perception. And in fact, this is actually my favorite. It leads to these discussions that people fight over whether what they heard and whether what they heard is true or not. So a couple of years back, there was this one recording that split the entire world into two. The same recording was heard as either Laurel or Yanni, and some people argued that they heard both and nobody believed them. So the New York Times decided to put an entire website to decide whether you're a Laurel person or a Yanni person. So you slide this while listening to the recording and you just pick, you find your Laurel and Yanni boundaries. So the individual variabilities that we observe in our perception is one of the mechanisms that can explain these is known as perceptual narrowing. It's this idea that within the first year of life, our auditory and visual systems undergo perceptual narrowing. It's tuning into the information that surrounds us and disregarding the information that's not close to our proximate. So for instance, in the language domain, we observe this a lot, losing the ability to discriminate sounds in different languages. And as a result of this, there is this tuning into the differentiation of the sounds of infants' first language or languages. But we also see this in the visual domain, that infants who are surrounded by faces, they of course become more familiar with those faces. And over time, they lose the ability to discriminate other type of faces. Now, in my research, I'm using multilingualism as an anchor point to perceptual narrowing and defining differences in audiovisual speech perception. Now, some of you might ask, why am I targeting multilingualism? What's the relevance of that? Well, multilingualism can be used as a way to tap into those individual differences, and because multilinguals are potentially those who have exposure to more variability in their everyday life. Because we know that listeners' experience with language and society builds their linguistic representations. We do not have a hard drive that we stick into our head and then it just automatically creates our linguistic representations. We actually create those by meaningful interactions with others. And in my research, I am focusing on this question. And today I will be showing you three different studies that I conducted for my dissertation. And I will be walking you through from sociolinguistics research to experimental linguistics and combined with network approaches. And I'll be doing so by keeping multilingualism in the center of my research, and also by focusing on how this tuning in results in our everyday linguistic judgments, and particularly our accentedness judgments. Now, let me start with asking you this question: what is an accent? It's a very deep question. It is really hard to answer. And also, everyone has an idea of what an accent is. You can ask anybody in your surroundings and ask them, do this person, do they have an accent? And they will say, well, to me, it's this much of an accent. And then you can do that for your entire network, basically. But only few people acknowledge that we all have accents. And this is really important because somehow we forget that our accents are our own identities. What we observe in our accents is our voice, and of course our signs as well. We observe accents in sign languages too. And what we have in our identities is our past, present, and also reminiscence of our future. So when we look at an accent, what we can trace is the linguistic past and present easily. So if you ever lived in a place that is different than where you're born and raised, it could be a different city, it could be a different neighborhood, it could be a different country. I'm sure you might have gotten this question. So where exactly are you from? And that question comes from this idea that using accents to approximate our social ties, because accents allow us to kind of make sure that, is this person my in-group member? Do they speak the same language? Do they speak the same variety or not? Right? And it eventually also leads to outgrouping others. This person does not speak the variety that I am speaking. And this is, again, as a result of that perceptual narrowing, that we tune into the sounds that surround us and the ones that are in our immediate environment. And again, that leads to our hypersensitivity towards variation. So we immediately detect if other person has an accent or not, or their accent is different than ours or not. And this is completely fine because, again, we do this as a result of our cognitive maturation. But then it becomes very complex and problematic when we use an accent to make sure that, when we use an accent to attest other people's, for instance, attractiveness level or their intelligibility or their the way that they engage in their work or education. So we have these assumptions about other people's performance based on their accent. And this is particularly evident in the word English's literature. So I will walk you through what this literature tells us and why it's important to focus on accents in particularly word English's area. And this goes all the way back to the colonial development. So through colonialization, different varieties of English emerge as the English language travel around the world. But the way that these different varieties emerge is not the same. They differ in terms of their context. So according to Kutlu, there are these three circles of English varieties. The first one is known as the inner circle variety, where speakers of these varieties hold the ideal English speaker status. They are granted this status and their English abilities are not questioned. Now, the inner circle variety is also highly associated with whiteness, that the more white a person is, the better they're perceived as the ideal speaker of English. Now, the outer circle varieties emerge as a result of exploitation colonialism, that English was brought to another country through bunch of different process in the timeline. And what happened is that English was imposed to that community over time, and it led to the emergence of that community's variety of English, which we observe in, for instance, Nigerian English or Indian English, for instance. And unlike inner circle varieties, outer circle varieties are not, or speakers of outer circle varieties are not granted this ideal speaker of English status. What they're perceived as is that their language practices are not legitimate and they lack the proficiency of their own language. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm not going to go into too much detail of expanding circle, but those are varieties that emerge as a result of English being taught as a foreign language. Right. So when English was brought to India by British colonization in the 18th century, back then India was a multilingual country. India is still a multilingual country. Indian English emerged as one of the varieties of English that's spoken in particularly context of India. Now, there's not one Indian English. There are actually multiple Indian Englishes that are spoken all across India. Indian English speakers grow up hearing their own variety. They're high proficient in their own variety. And also they use this language in education or government setups. Now, when you look at Indian English speakers, they're not perceived as the ideal English speakers compared to, for instance, American and British English. They are oftentimes asked to correct their accent or pick a more neutral accent, whatever those mean. And this shows us the inner and outer circle dynamics because accents play a huge role in defining who we assign the status of ideal speaker English and who we don't give this status, because by looking at these circle differences, you can say that, well, outer circle varieties are always attested to foreign accented speech, or their speech is associated with more foreignness in it. Right. So the first study that I was showing you today is a sociolinguistic study where, in collaboration with Dr. Caroline Wiltshire, we wanted to create a survey where we ask people of their, first of all, exposure to American, British, and Indian English, but also whether they have preferences over these varieties. So what we found, we had a bunch of different questions, but I'm going to show you the ones that are most relevant for today. So in one of the set of questions, we ask participants whether they would prefer Indian English an Indian English speaker over an American English speaker or over a British English speaker. And we asked them in the context of educational settings or in the context of workplace settings. And what we found was very alarming. We found that when we asked participants whether they pick Indian English over American English and Indian English over British English, you can see that there was a clear dispreference towards Indian English, and that individuals did not prefer an Indian English speaker over American or British English speaker in any basically educational or workplace related context. Now, we then ask, well, maybe it's because they're not exposed to, or they're exposed to in a way that they have maybe negative experiences with their exposure. And when we asked them about their exposure levels, it was actually the opposite. You can see that there's 1.7% exposure to Indian English, and that was somewhat exposed. So participants were not aware of what Indian English was and how much they were exposed. So they were just giving us an estimate. And later in the questionnaire, when we asked them what that exposure consists of, the majority of our participants responded that they have Indian English exposure through media, and particularly the Apu character in The Simpsons, which we already know that it's already a problematic character because it was voiced by a white actor. Now, this is not the only way that we see misrepresentation of Indian English, that there's always the emphasis of Indian English speakers are harder to understand, they're incomprehensible, and that their variety is mocked oftentimes in different entertainment categories. Now, then the question becomes even more complicated, because if our participants didn't have exposure, but they still have this preference towards Indian English, then we can argue that, well, Indian English speakers are stigmatized because there's the assumption that I'm going to hear someone speaking Indian English and I will not understand it properly, right? And that association, again, going back to the accent slide, it is the dangerous one, because we are making these assumptions without having full exposure. So unlike similar to other outer circle varieties, Indian English also shares the same racialization and also stigmatization of the variety itself without having a proper exposure. So in the second study, we wanted to investigate whether we can tap into the perceptual differences while we were using these three varieties. So we asked how do listeners in different social networks perceive and judge English varieties. And this is in collaboration with McGill, Steffi Wolf, and Debra Titone. What we did was we brought in previously normed faces from face databases. These are white and South Asian faces. And we also recorded American, British, and Indian English. We also normed those sentences just so that they have equal amount of intelligibility. And our experiments was twofold. So the first part was we gave these, we presented faces, and then we presented the audio, and we asked participants to type down what they heard. In the second experiment, we asked participants to judge whether the person had an accent or not. And we gave them a 9-point Likert scale, 1 being no accent whatsoever, and 9 means heavily accented. And aside from that perceptual approach, we also looked at from a network approach. So again, we know that listeners' experience with the language and with society builds their linguistic representations. So when we look at the interactions, the social interactions and their network, if there's more racial and linguistic diversity, we argued that, well, maybe this will help them in terms of understanding different varieties and also lower their accent misjudgments because they will have a more flexible perception. And we used Levaria's social network questionnaire. We adapted directly from hers, and then we changed a couple of questions. We asked particularly the racial and linguistic profiles of those individuals. This led us to categorize or group our participants as racial less diverse or racially more diverse. Now, again, just to remind you, these were the two tasks, and now I will be walking you through the results. First, I will show you the intelligibility results. Now, the y-axis here is the proportions, which means the accuracy of intelligibility, the intelligibility questions or the intelligibility process. So we asked them to type down what they heard, and we calculated these proportions. 1 means completely accurate. The lower the number is, the more errors were introduced in their transcription. And the x-axis here is representing face type. SA represents South Asian and W represents white. Each language variety is color-coded, and the left side is going to be a racially less diverse group, and the right side will be a racially more diverse group. Now, immediately, if we look at the first group here, the green and the orange one, you can see that whenever we presented American English with a white face, it was perfectly accurate. And then whenever we switch a white face to the South Asian face, the intelligibility dropped down. Same thing happened for British English. Whenever we switch from a white face to a South Asian face, their intelligibility dropped down such that they introduced more errors in their transcription. Now, it happened with a great extent for Indian English, that you can see that whenever we presented Indian English with a white face, it's all the way up there, and immediately South Asian faces decreased the intelligibility scores or proportions. If you look at racially more diverse group, you can see that they're almost overlapping. There was no group difference, that racially less diverse group and racially more diverse group transcribed these sentences equally the same, that whenever we switch from a white face to a South Asian face, their intelligibility dropped down. Now, let me walk you through for their accentedness judgments. Again, remember, this is when we asked them whether the person had an accent or not, and they were given a 9-point Likert scale. So here, the Likert scale will be on the x-axis. 1 means no accent whatsoever. 9 is all the way on the right side, heavily accented. Y-axis this time is the density of scores. So the amount of time that they keep pressing the same button to indicate their accentedness judgments. The left side is the less diverse group, and the right side is the more diverse group again. So if you look at the less diverse group first, you can see that when we asked them to judge American English recordings, they were more varied, but mostly on the left side. It was very left skewed. For the British and Indian English, they had clear, when they were pressing the buttons, they had clear assumptions of what button they need to press, because you can see that these had the peaks, which again shows the density of the amount of time that they keep pressing. Now, British English was judged a little bit lower than Indian English by just looking at these graphs. But then when you look at the more diverse group, a different pattern emerges. This time, they had, for American English, very clear understanding of what button they need to press, which is on the left side. So it's left skewed this time, that they indicated that American English is less accented. And if you look at British English, which is the orange one, and Indian English, which is blue purplish one, you can see that it's more varied, it's more smooth, that you cannot see peaks, which suggests that for but the individuals who were in more diverse social networks, they were not sure what button they need to press when they were listening to Indian English and British English. They had this more distributed press button performance. The same data now I will be showing you with the face information. So again, y-axis is going to be accentedness judgments this time, and the x-axis will be the faces. Now, if you look at racial less diverse group, you can see that immediately when we switch from a white face to a South Asian face, their accentedness judgments increase, that they judge American English paired with a South Asian face as more accented compared to a white face. And again, remember, these are the same recordings that they're listening to. For British English, the same thing happened as well. Whenever we switch from a white face to a South Asian face, their judgments increase. So these two share the same pattern. If you look at Indian English, the face, there was no face effect. Indian English was judged as more accented compared to British and American English, but the presented faces did not matter in terms of the accentedness judgments. Now let's look at racially more diverse group. Here, American English has the exact same pattern as the racial less diverse group, changing the faces from a white face to a South Asian face, increase accentedness judgments. But look what happens here. For British English, first of all, their judgments were much lower on the scale. So they, racially more diverse group, judged British English as less accented. And faces didn't matter when they were judging British English. They judged them equally the same in terms of their accentedness. And if you look at Indian English, another different pattern emerges. Whenever we presented Indian English with a white face, their accentedness judgments was lower compared to when we presented Indian English with a South Asian face. We also found that, so aside from this difference here, we also found a group difference that a more diverse group judged Indian English presented with a white face as less accented compared to racially less diverse group when we presented Indian English with a white face. So what do we find here? We found that social network diversity did not impact the intelligibility or the transcriptions, that whenever we switch faces from a white face to a South Asian face, intelligibility dropped down. But it did impact the accentedness judgments, such that, first of all, social network diversity reduced judgments, accentedness judgments for British and Indian English, but also it does it towards British English more so than towards Indian English. And moreover, the social network diversity favored white faces for Indian English, that whenever we presented Indian English with white faces for racially more diverse group, their judgments were lowered. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to bring to your attention. We conducted this study in Gainesville, Florida, which is a small college town in Florida, and with a bunch of bilingual and multilingual presence, but also a lot of single language use. And the diversity of a college town in comparison to other locales can, of course, be problematic. So we wanted to replicate our study in a place where we can actually tap into racial and linguistic diversity from a different angle. So to do so, we, with Debra's help, we conducted the same exact study in Montreal and one more time in Gainesville again. And we asked this question: can the multilingual experience impact the perception of racialized English varieties? Now, why did we pick Montreal? Well, Montreal, again, has this diverse neighborhood profile, but also Montreal has the higher linguistic and racial diversity in comparison to Gainesville. But instead of the network approach that we did in the previous one, this time we wanted to bring the entropy measure to, first of all, compare these two locales in terms of their bilingual use or bilingual language use. And to do this, we use language entropy package that was created by Kutlu and Titone. What does this measure do? It's the language entropy measure language entropy is a measure that characterizes the diversity of language use in a given context. So it gives you how balanced the language use within that context. And it works in a way that you can bring the answers from the language history, language background questionnaires, and then you can plug that into R, the language entropy package in R, and then it calculates a number between 0 and 1. For our case, it's 1 because it gets the log of number of languages. So the closer the number to 1, it means that there's more dual language use, such that bilinguals use both languages equally the same, or there's more bilingual use or the dual language use in that environment. If the if the number is closer to 0, it means that bilinguals oftentimes they tend to use single language in their everyday life. And this is called as the integrated versus compartmentalized. Integrated is the more dual language use, compartmentalized is more single language use. If you look at this graph here, you can see that Montreal entropy is much closer to 1 than the Gainesville entropy measure. And this is what we were expecting because, again, Gainesville, even though it's a Spanish-English bilingual community, the presence of Spanish is very low. It's oftentimes only English language use. But in Montreal, French and English use is much more balanced than the Spanish-English use in Gainesville. So we wanted to see whether the presence of that integrated bilingual community could impact the way that people engage in this task. So we used the exact same design, but this time comparing Montreal to Gainesville. I will be walking you through the intelligibility scores first. So again, you're seeing proportions here as a result of transcription accuracy. One means highly accurate. And this time Gainesville will be marked with purple and then Montreal will be marked with yellow. You can see that whenever we present American English with a white face, both groups did exactly the same, very high accuracy. Whenever we switch faces from a white face to a South Asian face, Gainesville participants' intelligibility dropped again. Montreal participants didn't show that effect. Same thing happened for British English and same thing happened for Indian English. Every time we switch faces from a white face to a South Asian face, their accuracy went down in Gainesville and not in Montreal. I will be showing you this exact same data from a different visualization perspective, just so that you can see the variability in a clearer way. You can see that in Montreal, everything is right skewed, that whenever we presented these different varieties, whatever face type we use, it didn't matter. Participants kept transcribing those sentences. But look at the Gainesville part here, that whenever we presented Indian English or whenever we presented South Asian faces, their transcription accuracy was impacted. Now I will show you the accentedness judgments. The y-axis is going to be accentedness scores again, and the x-axis will be the different conditions. You can see clearly that the face effect emerged immediately in Gainesville again, especially for American English. Whenever we switch from a white face to a South Asian face, the accentedness judgments increase, and it did not affect Montreal participants' accentedness judgments, neither for British English and nor for Indian English. And just to, again, show you from a different perspective, you can see that in Gainesville, American English was judged as the least accented. British English recordings were judged in the middle, somewhere in the middle. Indian English was judged as the highest or the highly accented variety. So there's this more stepwise increase of accentedness judgments. But if you look at Montreal data here, American English recordings was judged as less accented, and British and Indian English recordings was judged equally accented in terms of their, again, accentedness level. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the multilingual experience shapes the way that we engage in transcribing different varieties of Englishes, that we didn't find any face effect in Montreal, and we did replicate our face effect in Gainesville one more time. We also did find these different patterns of judging Indian English and British English in Montreal compared to Gainesville, that it seems like in Montreal, participants designated both Indian and British English as the other variety, and judging American English that is closer to their own variety. Whereas in Gainesville, participants judged British English in the middle somewhere, that indicated that British English is somehow closer to their variety, but also it's not as accented as Indian English. Now, what did I show you here? I first show you that there's low exposure to Indian English. And even though there's this low exposure, there's also a high dispreference towards Indian English speakers in the context of United States, and which suggests that Indian English is still stigmatized. Now, if you look at the perception task results, you can see that racial diversity in one social network did impact accentedness judgments, but not the intelligibility of their engagement with the task. And finally, living in multilingual locales that have more integrated multilingual or bilingual systems differed in terms of how compartmentalized bilingual communities engage with accentedness judgments, which suggests that particularly in perception studies, we need to pay much attention to where we're conducting our studies, in what context we're doing our study, and also what is the social understanding of our task in that given community. So with that, I will transition this to this final part, that linguistic stigmatization is evident in our everyday life, and it's targeted towards outer circle varieties. In fact, if you search Indian English and call center terms on social media sites such as Twitter, you will see that general public is already targeting Indian English speakers as being incomprehensible, not good for a workplace like call center, which eliminates their access to education, workplace, and also equal human rights. So their accent is being used against them, and it eliminates their advancements in our society, which again, we do not see in inner circle varieties of English. Now, at the beginning, I showed you this quote, and after years of contemplating with this quote, I came to realization that maybe we should be frightened not by the hat itself, but by our speed in deciding that that is a hat. And we need to remind ourselves that we all have accents and hold ourselves accountable in terms of how we use accents and accent misjudgments in our everyday life. So with that, I would like to acknowledge all my undergraduate students who helped me tremendously in preparing this work, in testing participants. Of course, Debra, McGill, Ruo, who helped me tremendously in collecting data in Montreal, and Debra's lab, Language and Multilingualism lab. members of Brain Cognition and Development Lab, and Dr. Lisa Scott, and also all the generous funding that I received over the last couple of years. And thank you so much. I will transition to Debra now, and she will be taking over to walk you through some more network approaches.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see if I can do this smoothly. Okay, it's really a pleasure to follow Ethan, who is doing such incredible work. I find his results to be so cool. And what I thought I would just take the opportunity to do right here is, in the 10 minutes that I have, is to just sort of contextualize Ethan's study within the situation of the work that's going on in my lab, and maybe just highlight some of the other students who are contributing to this. And also, we've been in my lab trying to develop new ways of thinking about how sociolinguistic approaches could be used to theorize and empirically derive predictions about psycholinguistic sorts of variables. So this is like all work in progress. So yeah, let's see. Okay, here we go. So Ethan showed some maps. I like to show maps too. This is a really great website if you're interested in language use across Canada. So you could basically zoom in on any place within Canada and get the 2016 census of what's happening. So this is the island of Montreal. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. This is the surrounding areas. Each dot represents a different language, home language use. And you can see that red is English, blue is French. Then we have all these other languages that are there as well. And you could really see this characteristic pattern of what's going on in Montreal, where it's mostly French, as one would expect, given that Quebec is a monolingual Francophone province. But then there are these pockets of English, but also lots of other colors, right? So we think that the West Island of Montreal, from like Westmount, NDG on, is more Anglophone, but you could see that it's really a hodgepodge. And so you could think about, like, when I think about the studies that I do in terms, me and my students do in terms of psycholinguistic approaches to bilingualism, we really have to be mindful of the specific sociological context of what is happening with bilingualism. And often in my field, I'm sure I know there's people here at UBC who are doing fantastic work merging the sociolinguistics with the psycholinguistics, but it feels like within the field at large, there isn't enough of this, right? So it's really important to think about bilingualism as it manifests in specific locations and the socio and cultural implications of that. So you could see here that because of this sort of language distribution, there's going to be a certain way that English and French is going to be valued, and that might play a role in terms of how bilingualism manifests itself. So if I go to the next slide, so this is just, again, emphasizing the idea that bilingualism means so many different things in so many different locations, and even within a location, right? So here now we're zooming in on linguistic diversity within particular neighborhoods in Montreal, right? So the legend is the number of languages spoken in homes in particular geographic areas. And you could see that there are some neighborhoods within Montreal, and there's this one track here where basically there's, like, in this certain neighborhood, there's 47 or 48 unique languages spoken across homes, right? So even within a city, bilingualism is a very heterogeneous thing. And if psycholinguists such as myself want to really do a good job at characterizing this, I think we need to think seriously about these sorts of issues. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Here, I pulled this morning. This is Vancouver, right? So you could see the color array is very different from what I just presented to you in Montreal. Now it's mostly red with some smattering of green. I don't really see that much blue there. And by green, it's Chinese. Blue, I'm not seeing a lot of French there. I'm also seeing some white dots in different locations, right, which is reflected as other. So I'm wondering if that's indigenous languages and things of this sort, right? So again, Vancouver is a bilingual city to a great extent, right? We see there's lots of evidence here of bilingualism happening, but that has a completely different flavor than what we see in Montreal. And we could play this game with every city across Canada, and we could certainly do that with cities across the world. And basically the bottom line here is that bilingualism isn't just one thing, right? And so what we've been trying to do, so a lot of this, I have to thank Margal Tiv, who's a senior doctoral student in my lab. She shared some slides with me. And of course, she's been integral in the work that we've been doing in the lab, right? As Ethan mentioned. So we're trying to sort of develop theoretical approaches that can help us think more systematically about how the sociolinguistic context can merge with psycholinguistic properties, right? So we have come up with this sort of systems, what we're calling the systems framework of bilingualism, where we have these embedded spheres of social influence, right? So the idea here, of course, is that most of what psycholinguists are interested in is what's happening at the bottom. But what's happening at the bottom is really embedded in this kind of rainbow of different social constraints. So you can have interpersonal constraints, person-to-person interactions. There could be neighborhood, which we call ecological constraints. So the neighborhood, the school, the workplace. Then there are sort of societal level constraints. So I think about in Quebec, how there are these language laws that really impact life on a daily basis, irrespective of the particular neighborhood that you live in. And then, of course, all of these things can vary over time. And that's represented here by these different phases of the moon. And the time can be both historical in terms of how historically language and how language is considered within a particular society can change over time, but it also could be developmental, right? So this is meant to be a little bit flexible in thinking about these things. So the whole idea here is we're trying to conceive of ways of understanding how social context is important and social experiences are complex. And we believe this is missing largely from the study of human behavior and cognition, such as language and bilingualism, which is quite ironic when you think that bilingualism is such a sociologically embedded thing. And in fact, even monolingualism is, right? So when Ethan was talking, as someone who was brought up in New York City, and I think back when I had my New York accent, and I probably still have it to some degree. And then I went to college in New York, and people who were outside of New York City weren't there. And I was different because of my New York City accent. Then I go to upstate New York and I sound like a city person. But when I go back after being in upstate New York, I sound like a country person. So this whole, all of these issues really are part of language with a capital L. It's not just bilingualism. So of course, I think everybody realizes this, but the challenges are in terms of operationalization and quantification. Because one of the things that psycholinguists value, as we all know, is to conduct very tight experimental studies where we can very precisely implement a manipulation, measure things. And some of these sociolinguistic things are, quite frankly, very complex and very fuzzy, and it makes it hard to do that. So what we've been trying to do in my lab is try to figure out how can we approach this in a way that could be, that can naturally dovetail with the kind of approaches that psycholinguists normally do. So we have different projects going on. Ethan mentioned Jason Gullifer's language entropy approach, which I'll just mention very quickly in passing. We've now hit upon using network science to try to start to quantify how bilinguals, what they talk about and who they talk to in their normal domains. And then now we're even starting to link more to language census properties to try to get at that sociological layer, right? So this idea being that language entropy can really capture something potentially about individuals in the way, with the very measures that we all already collect in our various language history questionnaires. Network science might allow us to get at that interpersonal layer, and then linking all of this to the census and thinking about the socio-ecological context is a way of getting at that top level. So let me So this, just very quickly, Ethan already talked about this. We have a number of papers now looking at this measure of trying to apply this measure of language entropy. Of course, entropy is something that is, it's a measure. It's like an average or a median or a mean. And I think what the insight was that we contributed here was that we can use this very flexible measurement approach to talk about linguistic balance, right? And it's very flexible, and it can go above one. It can vary. There are different ways that you can handle this. It can scale with multiple language uses. And you could see what I have plotted here is a simple illustration of language entropy and how it tracks with a very common measure that we collect in the lab, which is percentage exposure to English, right? So the idea here being that if somebody uses English 0% of the time, that means they're using French 100%. Of course, this is linked to Montreal. And then as the language use, as English use goes up, you can get to a point where it's 50-50. And at that point, you're at maximal entropy, right? Because it's completely unpredictable what language could be used. But then as you sort of increase to the other side, then entropy goes down, right? So what this idea is getting at, this issue of language balance, right? To what extent people know lots of languages potentially, but they may not use these languages consistently in daily life. And maybe it's not the knowledge of an L2 or an L1 that is important, but how those languages are used. And so what this measure does is it allows us to get at this. And another potentially interesting reason why this measure could be useful is that I don't know how all of you feel, but I know sometimes when we do studies, it's often unclear what the L1 is for a person, right? So, people, do we go with the dominant language? Do we go with the first language? What do we go with? And in some ways, using this kind of a tool hedges that, right? Because here it doesn't matter what the L1 is, what you assign as the L1. It has to do with what are all the languages that somebody knows and how often do they use them? So it could be useful in that regard. So we've used this measure of language entropy to predict lots of different things. We have a paper predicting resting state connectivity. We have a paper predicting language proficiency and self-ratings of accentedness judgments. And now we've moved on to things like cognitive control and so on and so forth. So this is just one way that we've gone about quantifying. And in fact, you can scale this up to populations. So in a paper that McGill and our team have just submitted, it's not really entropy that we're using here, but it's the same kind of idea where you could take census data and you could look to see how, what is the diversity of language use across a population. And what's cool when you think about these sorts of quantifications is that now you could put everybody in the same space. You could put people in the same space. You could put society, neighborhoods in the same space, and that could be very convenient as a tool. Okay, so moving on very quickly from this, as I said, we've been starting to use network science to think about how to map the interpersonal dimensions of bilingualism. And I know I saw McGill and Ruo in the audience here, so perhaps they could even jump in at the question and answer session. But one of the first ways that we went about using network science was, again, to go back to our questionnaire data. I mean, all of us give questionnaires, and I suspect that we don't use all the questions that we have in those questionnaires, right? So what we really tried to do here is we went back to a questionnaire where my goal was to try to get at these topics, to try to get at what are the different contexts that people use their different languages in. And we coded the data from the questionnaire in a way using network science, and to ask the question, what distinguishes communicative context, topics, or language use? So just to give you an example of what we did in this paper is we had different topics like news, gossip, sports, and then we had three things for each person: the topics that they talked about, the context, the social context in which they use them, and the languages that they used, right? So what we did was we always created the nodes to represent the topics, and then we flexibly designated the edges, the connections, to be one or the other things, right? So in one set of networks, we created context networks where, again, the nodes are topics, and then whether there's a connection between those nodes has to do with whether those topics were used in the same social context or not. By social context, they could be in the home, at work, at school, so on and so forth. And then we graded the connection strength based on the number of languages that were used, okay? And then we could flip it. We could do it the other way, right? Where here, I have to move, sorry, the box here, where again, the topics are the nodes, and then the connections are whether those two topics are spoken about in the same language or not, or in the same language or different languages. And then again, we could grade it based on the number of contexts. So you see how we could build different network measures that get at slightly different things. So when you play this game, what you find, so this is the networks where what we've mapped basically are different social settings in which the topics, which are the nodes, are happening. And you could see that the colors are indexing whether people talk about those topics in those settings in one language or in multiple languages. And what you could take away from this is that, so it really ranges from yellow to turquoise here, right? So you could see the work context is very single language oriented, right? So people are talking about these topics and they tend to talk about it in one language at a time. But as you scale up, you could see that people are using more languages to talk about these topics in these more socially oriented situations, social settings. So similarly, if we do the network the other way, and now if what's being plotted here is what the topics people are talking about in the non-dominant language versus the dominant language, and the colors are indexing the number of social contexts in which these topics are being discussed, you could see a different kind of pattern where in the dominant language, I'm going to start with that, the color is purple. So that means people are talking about every topic across social contexts all the time in their dominant language, but they're more specialized in their non-dominant language. And we followed up on this by using a community detection algorithm, which basically goes through these networks and looks for in a bottom-up fashion, looks for clusters. And you could see that basically in the dominant language, all the topics are really clustering in this one cluster. And then there's a couple of highly specialized topics that are clustering in this other cluster. So it's like sports and community civic stuff, right? So basically this is representing the idea that people are talking about the same, in their dominant language, anything goes. They talk about any topic in any context, but in the non-dominant language, it's much more specialized, right? So we have more communities that are detected, and it's more separate to some extent. So this is just one way that we've used network science to try to get at bilingualism, to get a different window into what's happening within this particular Montreal community that we're studying. Of course, if we played this game in Vancouver or Ottawa or anywhere else where bilingualism might arise for different reasons, the patterns may differ. Now, we're also using network science to get more at individual differences in how people use languages in their social network. So this, I don't have time to tell you about this, but I'm just going to give you, this is all work that's like, it's either under review or we're about to submit it, where we tested 106 bilinguals in Montreal, and we asked them to tell us who is in their social network and what languages do they use when they communicate with that person. So based on that information, we can create different social network representations that have mathematical descriptors with them that we could then use to put into our linear mixed effects models to predict all kinds of things, right? We could predict how they relate to language processing. We could try to predict how they relate to general cognitive function. And that's basically what we're doing. So we have 2 papers. One is under review now, where we're linking it to language ability and language census measures to try to bridge those levels that I talked about before. Ruo, who's also here, I saw before, she is looking at language attitudes, how these social network measures within the context of Montreal link to attitudes about French and English in Montreal. And Jason Gullifer is now prepping data to try to ground language entropy in these social network kinds of measures. So, so going back to the beginning, basically what we're trying to do in our lab, and this is work with lots of students in my lab, and including Ethan, who is an honorary lab member of my lab, you know, in perpetuity. We're trying to start to systematically bridge these levels in ways that could be quantitative and precise, and that could tell a bigger and more interesting picture about bilingualism than I think what, I mean, of course, it's very interesting what's out there now, but I think it would really enrich our field of psycholinguistics to get a little bit more real about how bilingualism plays out in the real world. So this is my lab, the Zoom shot. Here's the people I mentioned today. And of course, I'm just really privileged to work with such amazing students. So thank you. That's all I have.
And thank you. And of course, applause and virtual applause to both Ethan and Deb for these fantastic, really fascinating talks, fascinating work, and creative and impactful. I really thank you guys. And I can see the audience really reacting, and we had some really interesting comments in the chat. So we do have about 20 minutes for questions. So I invite you to indicate questions in the chat. If you put them in the chat, I can read them out for you. Or if you want to raise your hand, I welcome you to do that, and you can ask your questions aloud. Maybe while people are thinking of their questions, I could get the ball rolling. Ethan, I was really fascinated with these stark differences between the Gainesville and the Montreal communities. And I think your point that we have to study multiple communities, in terms of making generalizations, we have to be really careful, as your research showed. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you conceptualize these differences. So you talked about multilingualism, but of course, that's just one difference between these different communities. There are other differences, at the governmental level, societal attitudes, all of these things. Maybe could you talk more about, what you're thinking about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question, Krista. So one thing that I really would like to emphasize in my research, and we have done this with McGill and Debra recently as well, that we would like to focus on this idea that multilingualism experience is not a unified experience, right? And there's this assumption that in especially experimental research that all multilinguals have to share the same cognitive and social understanding of language use. But what we see particularly in the United States, and recently, I believe Ruth is here somewhere. I don't see her at the moment, but with Ruth, we actually worked on heritage speakers in the United States, and we looked at attitudes towards heritage speakers, because this is a very similar participant group that I actually had in my dissertation research, that the majority of my participants here were Spanish, English heritage speakers. And what happens is that oftentimes these folks encounter so much societal pressure to not use Spanish that when we look at the research, of course, we can categorize them as bilinguals, but what we're seeing is that, well, they don't get to even practice their second language and continue their education in Spanish, or get to hold on to being that identity of Spanish English speaker, right? And it's the complete opposite in Montreal. The couple times that I visited Montreal, I've never seen anyone proudly saying that they're monolingual, that everybody says that there's this understanding of bilingual identity. Of course, there's that governmental layer and language policy, but it is this integrated understanding that bilingualism is not hindering anything from their societal value, which is the opposite that we observe in the United States. So it is really important to, when we're focusing on especially these comparative work across different regions within the same continent, we're looking at just North America, and it could be a complete different story if you look at Europe or Asia, where multilingualism is perceived completely different than how we're perceiving it. So I think just going back to your question, what we need to do is, first of all, highlight that there are differences and there are ways to measure these differences that we shouldn't be afraid of. And I mean, your lab in terms of developmental work and how to document it is actually one of the leading ones, right? We know that we can actually document these differences across the language used at home, outside of home. And that just shows that we have a lot of work to do and we shouldn't be afraid of putting the effort in.
Thank you. I saw a hand up earlier on from Félix de Metrudel. I don't know if Félix, you still have a question, if you're still there.
It's actually very crucial to also assess the tools that we're using, right? So what we used here was basically a modified version of a match guise technique that we guise the participants with, showing them different faces, but while keeping the speech recordings constant. So that just triggered perceptual differences, and initially, it's the sociolinguistic way of looking at how different accents are perceived. We combine it with experimental settings. And that just tells us that oftentimes, especially in psycholinguistic work, we disregard the sociolinguistic aspect, that we were not very interested in these. And we perceive this as noise, that whenever we get to see these differences, we either excluded these participants or we counted them as like, oh, no, there's something happening here that we're not sure, we didn't control fully. But maybe it's not, the idea shouldn't be looking at it from a more controlled perspective, but kind of modifying our experiments in places where we can integrate social use of language, because it's language and social life, if they're tied together, right? If you try to separate it, what we're looking at could be completely different mechanisms. And I think in especially psycholinguistic work, we've been trying to separate them for a very long time, that we forgot conceptualizing what language is doing in social life. And that's why, just like how Debra mentioned, McGill's the moon, the graph that Debra showed, that is the perspective that we should adopt in our studies, because again, that just shows the diversity of language, and it's nothing to be afraid of. Actually, it's something that we should all appreciate. And we were not doing that very carefully, I would say, for a very long time.
Just to jump in on that, I think this is even if you want to be a hard-nosed psycholinguist and not think about these social issues, you kind of have to, right? Because like one of the things we often talk about in my lab is, we often get self-assessments, like, people rate their own language proficiency. And think about how a given person, in the context of Montreal, where we have Olympic athletes of, linguistic usage here, the kinds of multilingualism that you see here really should get a gold medal, compared to where I grew up in the States, where, if you could just count to 10 in another language, you feel like a genius, right? So all of that is going to impact how people self-assess, right, on our language questionnaires. So these are the kinds of things that, we have to pay attention to this stuff, whether we want to or not.
Great discussion. I'm going to go on to our next question asker, which is Maria Arredondo, who had her hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's actually, so before COVID, I believe everybody had this sentence. Before COVID, I had this planned assessment for another experiment in India, but because of everything, we had to postpone that. But so I had a couple of hypotheses here. Number one, Caroline Wilshire was one of my collaborators with the sociolinguistic survey. She actually went to India right before COVID happened. And then she asked the sociolinguistic questions of how they perceive Indian English, nothing to compare to other varieties, but how do they perceive Indian English? And there's this very different opinions about Indian English. So some people who live in India, and these are folks on the South part of India. So they're there's also the regional differences, but this was specific to South India. They perceive Indian English, some of them perceive Indian English as something that they need to work on, especially if they would like to continue in a life in Western world. Some of them believe that their English is perfectly fine. And some people argue that they follow British English norms when they're interacting with Westerners, but they follow Indian English when they're speaking at home. So, and that's why, and at some point I mentioned that there are multiple Indian Englishes as well, right? So there is the assumption that what Caroline was arguing, that when you compare Indian English spoken in West to East and North to South, they actually also have very strong opinions about those different Englishes, that some of them perceived other Indian Englishes as less intelligible or something that is not very suitable to speak in Western world. Now, why that might be driven from, that was the part where we were going to do the second study. Well, because the multilingual sphere in India is such complex that there's not one language, there's not two languages, there are over 100 languages present. And that just, for Indian English speakers or for people who live in India, what is language, what is variety, and what is good language, what is bad language? These practices need to be assessed more carefully, right? Because again, it's almost like a translanguaging experience that they have in India, that they switch between multiple languages very fluently, very fluent in multiple languages. And the way that they perceive languages, these are my feelings. I think it's very different than how we're perceiving it. So, but I really would like to do this test in India and also a replication in UK, possibly, to see whether we're replicating the phase effect and how people orient British English, especially on the scale in comparison to Indian and American English. But yeah, it's in my plans, hopefully. Yeah, we're definitely thinking about something online, but all the funding cuts and everything and how everything is working right now, we just didn't want to start it. But yeah, that's definitely in my plans. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Maria. We have our next question from Molly Bibble.
Language entropy, the thing about it is that it's going to be very sensitive to the context of what is happening within a particular geographic region. The other thing that is important to note about entropy is that it can be flexibly applied to certain levels, right? So Jason, for example, has some papers in the pipeline where you could look at entropy based on general, like, language responses to language questionnaires. You could look at it in response to questionnaires about like, which languages do you use when you're dreaming, when you're doing math, when you know what I mean? So it's not one thing. So that could be part of, so there are many reasons why it may not be comparably predictive across different locations, because the population just may differ, and also the what's being characterized might differ. So in fact, Jason, we've just talked about this, like writing a paper to try to get at that nuance in a way. So in terms of what we've done in the lab, Jason has been sort of establishing it in different levels, right? So initially we looked at it globally, and then he looked at more broken down by different types of language abilities. Like, as I said, we had a questionnaire and a data sample where people said what languages they used when they were dreaming, when they were thinking, when they were doing math, this, that, and the other thing. And then what he did was use principal components analyses to sort of separate them statistically, and then use that to predict, in this particular study that I'm thinking about, verbal fluency data. So like L1, L2 verbal fluency. So we've looked at it at that level. We've also looked at it in the BLC paper where we kind of introduced this idea. We looked at it in terms of self-rated accentedness measures and also self-rated second language proficiency. But we have to look at it in other ways, and we're trying to, like, we have lexical decision data that we want to see what happens. And of course, all of this, whenever we try to apply this measure, we're always asking the question, to what extent does language entropy, defined in any particular way, add variance over and above explain variance over and above other measures, right? So this is not to say that language entropy is the end all be all. And in fact, it's going to be highly correlated with other measures. So I think it's always really important to think in terms of, well, what value does it add over and above just basic ratings of second language usage, or over and above second language age of acquisition and things like that. But if you have data sets that you're looking at that you're puzzled over, feel free to get in touch, and we're happy to discuss with you if that would be helpful.
Thank you so much for that question. We've had a number of comments in the chat. We have some questions about how to take into account the assumptions and language ideologies that both participants and researchers bring to the research process. That's from Miki Wernicke. I don't know if Ethan or Deb have, this is part of an ongoing discussion that's been in the chat a little bit.
Yeah, would the person mind just getting a little more specific so we can dig into that a little bit more possibly?
Yeah, if that person could either speak or type in the chat if they wanted to follow up on that, or maybe this was just part of the ongoing discussion. So we can leave some time for that person to do that if they would like, but I can also take another question if there is another question at this point.
Well, I mean, I could just sort of, I mean, Ethan, do you want to sort of riff off that question? I'm happy to, but you can do it too.
So yeah, I was just going to mention that it is important, as researchers, our positionalities and how we approach, and also again our positionalities within our community, right? So again, with the network measure, entropy measure, we're accounting for the communities and trying to understand that, well, I might have my own biases as a researcher and looking at the data, but also integrating that with what the community is doing. And yeah, I think I just saw that you mentioned in the chat as well that the getting the right answer from participants is sometimes really challenging, and that's why forming questionnaires that's not priming participants to think in ways that we are judging their language abilities or kind of asking them to perform in certain ways, but what we're trying to do is really observe their language. And I think those are really important points that we should all account for. Yeah.
Yeah, just riffing off of that, I mean, it's a really important point, right? That as experimenters, we're human, and we have our human biases, and we have the questions that we ask, and the way we set up a study is based on sort of our preconceived ideas about how the system we're studying works, right? And of course, one salient debate, dare I say it, is the bilingual advantages debate in the field of multilingualism. And I find it so interesting that whether or not you believe it exists or not, people really differ in how they experimentally address that question, right? So some people try to experimentally address it using continuous measures, and you imagine there's shades of gray, and there's you could cut the individual difference space along many different dimensions. And other people approach it where we have a group of bilinguals, we have a group of monolinguals, and we didn't find a difference, right? So that's one way I think that, how the decisions we make when we do experiments are arising from our human thought process about what we think is happening with a particular phenomena. And we probably always want to be mindful of that and aware of that when we do our research.
Yeah, very thoughtful points. Thank you. There's a question, perhaps one of our last questions, because I'll have to start wrapping up soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. Actually, yeah, my future direction is going more towards heritage languages and speakers of heritage languages, different heritage languages, like all around North America, basically. But first of all, the idea about the questionnaire data and assessing heritage language performance is very challenging at the moment, because what we're using is that, for instance, you cannot in many cases perform a written task for a heritage language population, right? So there are limitations that we need to really come up with these idea that multilingualism research should be more accessible, not to multilinguals who can read and write and who are only multilinguals of French English or Basque Spanish, and it shouldn't be limited to regions where we know that there is this high educational effort to keep bilingualism intact. What we should focus on in reality is that the multilingualism, again, it's an experience that everybody is, a lot of people sharing with each other, but at a different level, right? So I know that I did some research in terms of Vancouver and heritage language situation in there, but oftentimes there's also the interactions of different communities. So the indigenous community versus immigrant community and how those communities interact with each other, which is a very intricate topic that I am really invested in observing in the future. But for Florida, some of the work that I've been doing is that it's just when we look at bilingualism in Florida, it's not the same as bilingualism again in Montreal, Canada. There are clear differences that a couple of times, not for this task, but in different experiments where I had to recruit bilinguals, when I asked participants to fill out the questionnaire and ask them, are you a bilingual? They just say, no, I'm not a bilingual. And then I had to tell them, no, you have to be a bilingual, otherwise you're not qualified for this study. And then they will just say, oh yeah, and I speak Spanish fluently, right? So they hide their identity of speaking Spanish just because they're so afraid of being projected to, oh, your English is not good enough, or I'm gonna assess your English in different ways, right? So these are really important points. And it also reflects something about how we're doing our research, that we're scaring these communities, right? It shows that our work is not integrated with the communities, but what we're doing is for our sake, and we are kind of disregarding their well-being, basically. So I really think it's really important to focus on bringing more heritage language perspective into multilingualism research.
Again, a thank you to our fabulous speakers, UBC Language Sciences, for hosting this, as well as to our wonderful audience members for being here. So have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your week, and we hope to see you at another event. Bye, everybody.